So this is going to be fast. Good evening, church. Good evening. Welcome to the final Exodus Bible study today. Who's excited? All right, we're going to finish up Exodus and we're going to go into Joshua, and we've sprinkled in a little bit of Deuteronomy and Numbers because I am never going to teach a whole class on Deuteronomy or Numbers. And notice I'm not even touching Leviticus because it's just not that important to your daily life compared to these other ones. These stories are stories that you know. They impact our identity as Christians, as Judeo-Christians. They impact our faith life. And also, I will remind you or warn you that today is a PG-13 Bible study. So if you're here live or if you're watching online, this is a PG-13 audience. If you are under the age of 13, you need to pause and go get a parent before you continue watching this. Today we're going to talk about Exodus, and there's a couple of things I want to get caught up on. And not all of these are in Exodus proper, but they're the Exodus story. So Exodus is a book, but it's also a story. And the story of Exodus gets told in Exodus and Deuteronomy and Numbers and Leviticus and Joshua. It's the sort of the whole escape from Egypt and into the Promised Land spans many of those books. And what we find is there are different authors, and each author tells the story differently. Just like we have in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are telling the same story but differently, we have in Exodus and Deuteronomy. We know that Exodus is sort of the older narrative, and Deuteronomy is the next generation writing, hey, you need to learn this stuff. You need to tell your kids this. So Deuteronomy is the same story as Exodus, but with a bunch of tell your kids. Tell the kids, tell the next generation what's happening. And so we've got some fun stories here that I think really are influential for our faith, and I wanted to cover them today. Y'all say hi to Pastor Eric in the photo here. Hi, Pastor Eric. This is the story of Moses touching the rock, and this story isn't in Deuteronomy. But it's a story of the people grumbling, and it's really interesting because it's Moses grumbles to God. And a lot of people ask the question, is Moses an historical figure? And I think the answer is probably yeah to that. And the more complex the person is, the more likelihood that they were a real person. Does that make sense? Right? If they're just always a superhero and everything's always hunky-dory and great, that's when you should question, are we just sort of making them 2D or are they 3D? But Moses hates his job. He's a reluctant leader. On every single page, he has an Egyptian name, and he's leading the Hebrews. That part's interesting. There's a lot of texture on the character of Moses. And then in this one, when he's hitting the rock, the people are like, oh, we should have stayed slaves. We should have stayed slaves. And Moses is like, God, will you just do something? Like, I didn't ask for this. And then he says, did I give birth to all of these whiners and complainers? Are these people my problem? Right? Like, that's so good. That's such a natural inclination. Like, am I their parent? Do I really have to take care of them? Because I am done. I've had it up to here. And some of us who are biological parents also know that feeling. Can I get an amen for that? You're like, do I really have to take care of? Yeah. So God says, okay, go over to there and hit that rock with your rod, and water's going to come out of it. And Moses gets so mad he hits the rock twice. I just love that story. This picture of Moses hitting the rocks is from my seminary, Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary in Berkeley, California. That property has been sold in the last year to a Muslim seminary, I guess. So I don't know if Moses is still there. Maybe he is. Moses shows up also in the Quran, so maybe they still got Moses there. No way to know. But I just love this picture because it was from the courtyard, and I didn't really know the story very well when I started seminary. And then I would pass it, and as I kept passing it, it reminded me of how much I had learned since I got there, if that makes sense. So I took that picture when I went back to visit. Okay, here's another story called The Ark of the Covenant. Heidi, would you give them a warning about what I said earlier? the Ark of the Covenant, this is actually a picture of what movie? Yeah, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's right. You can see a young Harrison Ford here because he said he never wanted to be typecast after he did Star Wars, and then he did a whole nother typecast, right? He's doubly typecast. You gotta love it. You gotta love it. His agent has got to be one of the best agents that's ever been in the business. The Ark of the Covenant. So they're wandering around in the desert, and they start to worship God in some certain ways, and they want to preserve those. So they build this box, this treasure chest, this trunk, and they call it the Ark of the Covenant. And in it, Moses has said, well, he gets mad again, and he breaks the tablets. He throws them down on the ground after the golden calf, which we'll get to in a minute. And then they take all of the shards from the rock that he wrote the Ten Commandments on, and they put them in the Ark of the Covenant. Then there's another place where it says they also put jars of manna that they had collected in the Ark of the Covenant, and they put Aaron's staff. It says somewhere that they put that, and they probably put the basic building blocks of the Torah. This story of Exodus, maybe a little bit of the laws that are in Deuteronomy and Leviticus and Numbers, and maybe even some of that Genesis story, the root of that Genesis story, but most of that gets added and redacted much later. It's written as a prequel. Genesis is written as a prequel much later, just as Star Wars Episode 1 was written after what we now call Episode 6, right? That makes sense to us, but when we read Genesis, we're like, no, this is the first story. And then somebody's like, no, right? Just as if you told me that Jar Jar Binks was one of the original Star Wars characters, we'd be at war, right? That's just not true. But so the Ark of the Covenant was there to be the first preservation of the sacred. And that becomes really important for these people because in order to continue tradition, you need to have a basis for that. In the United States, we call ourselves a democracy, and the democracy has a document, right, as the basis for it. It actually has two documents, a Declaration of Independence and then a Constitution. And when you preserve those documents, they become the symbol of God, the symbol of the world the order that you've given to the chaos in which you live. So then they build this box, and then they're like, okay, well now the box needs a cool tent to be in. We can't really build a house because we can't carry a house, and we move around a lot, so we're going to build a cool tent, and they call that the tabernacle, okay? The sacred tent, yeah, the tabernacle. In 2 years, we're going to study the Gospel of John, and this is going to come up. So file that away. Tabernacle, all right, the word in Greek means to dwell. That word shows up in John all the time. It's the same word. It's meno in Greek, M-E-N-O, and it means to tabernacle, but it also means to dwell. It also means to abide. And if you read John, one of those three words is on every page. Why they translate the same word three different ways, I don't know, because it's hard for people like you to see that that's the same word over and over again. So they build the tabernacle, which is sort of a makeshift altar to God. And as soon as they've got something sacred, then they protect it, then they put a tent around it, and now they've limited access to God. Because only dudes can go in the tent. It's a holy tent for dudes. And to get close to the Ark of the Covenant is only for priests. Guess who wrote that rule? The priests did. The priests have the final editing say over all the 5 books of the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The very first line and the very last line of each book were written by the priests because they can. They've got hold of it, and we're going to see some of the conflict that comes up out of this. A lot of the conflict that comes up in these other stories is about who has access to God, and should we divide up who has access to God. Okay, there's a story in Exodus about a golden calf. It's about a golden calf, and it's not. 5 cool points. Who can tell me what this picture is a movie from? Is a picture from what movie? Anybody remember seeing a movie called Dogma with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck? And y'all haven't seen Dogma? Oh, man. Oh, that's like so my teenage angst. It's a Kevin Smith movie. Do you know who Kevin Smith is? Okay, good. God is played by Alanis Morissette in this movie. The angel Gabriel is Alan Rickman, who plays Professor Snape, right? And in it, it was written by Kevin Smith, and it's about how corrupt America has become. Okay, this is a 90s movie with very low budget, but it's fantastic. It's got all these great people in it. And the McDonald's of the day, if you will, the fast food chain is called Mubi, and Mubi is a golden calf. And they worship the golden calf, and Ben Affleck and Matt Damon are the angels of death that have been cast out of heaven. George Carlin is also like a priest in this movie, just for fun. And they get cast down from heaven, but they still have an idea of right and wrong, and they go to a board meeting of Mubi and the golden calf, and Matt Damon condemns them all and shoots them all in the boardroom. So it's an uplifting family film. It's really worth seeing. It's really a shame that, first of all, now that we have HD, it's like hard to go back and watch movies that weren't HD, right? You know what I mean? And more than that, it was low production value to begin with, or else I would make you all watch it, but I'm not sure that you would actually show up if I said we're going to do that. But it's really a fun movie. Again, Alanis Morissette playing God at the end is really great. Cool stuff. All right, so here's what happened. Here's the Exodus 32 story, and then I'm going to tell you what's really happening, okay? When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us." Gods is actually idols. It's actually idols. As for this fellow, Moses was brought us up out of Egypt. We don't know what has happened to him. Like, Aaron, why don't you be our leader now? Okay, that's what they're saying. Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they had handed to him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Okay, gods isn't really the right word. The word is idol, okay? And the idol that they are making is not another god. It is Yahweh. You see that? Here is your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Who brought you out of the land of Egypt? Yahweh, right? So it's not that they're worshiping other gods. It's that they're worshiping the true God the wrong way. You see how that's an important theological difference, okay? They're doing the thing that God didn't want, which is for you to make little figurines of God. And the reason why God doesn't want you to make little figurines is because then you fight over the figurines about who's got the right figurines, okay? So this is a story. I have a book on my shelf in my office called When Moses Met Aaron, and it's a book about church leadership, okay? This is bad church leadership, okay? Because Aaron is left in charge, and Moses is gone for a little while, and Aaron changes everything, okay? That is a bad number two. And the people are quick to move on from Moses. That guy who brought us out of Egypt, we don't even know who that is anymore. Let's do the new thing, okay? There are a lot of layers happening to the story. One of them is we know that Yahweh was considered a bull in many other versions of this, okay? God was considered a bull and many other iterations. Also, El, who all of these gods, and Baal, or Baal, B-A-A-L, they're all Yahweh and they're all not Yahweh. They all started out sort of like how Celtic crosses are now Christian, right? And Our Lady of Guadalupe was a theological construct before the Christians went to Brazil, right? And then it became Mary is Our Lady of Guadalupe, right? So where the origins of the story are is that people were worshiping a deity shaped like in the shape of a bull for about 500 years before this story takes place. We have stelae, which are like carvings in stone of Yahweh and Baal and El or Elohim that date back to the 17th century BCE. And at the earliest, this story is 1200 BCE. Okay, so that's 500 years before that. We know that those carvings already existed. So it's a culmination of he's gone, and God doesn't want us to make these, but we're going to go back to our old ways. Okay? So it feels to us, we read it like this is a new thing, and it is a new thing, but it's a new thing back to the old ways. Does that make sense? Okay? This is a de-evolution. It's new to them, but it's a de-evolution. And you're about to find out why. Okay? This is your PG-13 warning right here. So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they'd handed them, and he made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt," which is Yahweh. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day, the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings. Does God like burnt offerings? Not anymore. No. Sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. What are fellowship offerings? You should be wondering. Afterward, they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Okay? Now, if you look that word up in a bunch of different translations, it says party, it says good time. The word it doesn't say is orgy, but that's the word that it means. I don't know why people, when they translate things into Bibles, they try to hide the meaning in what's happening, like that makes it better. I don't understand why not confronting the reality is better than confronting the reality. Do you know what I mean? It's like you make it worse when you make it awkward, right? And I don't understand why they always choose to do that. Indulge in revelry means nothing to me. I don't know if it means something to you. Oh, indulge in revelry. Yeah, we know what that means. That means nothing to me. What's happening here is a de-evolution of human progressiveness, progression, okay? So think about that for a second. Yahweh brought us out of slavery. In slavery, we were slaves. It sucked. It was horrible. Everybody else told us what to do. When we got out of slavery, which happened when we crossed a body of water, and that's important because that's going to come up here and again, we crossed a body of water, and now we're in freedom. We are free, but we don't have any order in our chaos. We're just back to chaos. We are on our own. There's nobody telling us what to do. What shall we do? God has these rules for us, these commandments, and they are there to give us a better life. They're there to, remember we talked about last week about steering your desires, right? Steering your desires, using your desire to worship God in a healthy way, using your desire to love your wife in a healthy way, using your desire for competition and for being a good neighbor in a healthy way, and avoiding the ways that it's bad. That's what Moses is offering. That's what God's offering through Moses, I should say. But as soon as Moses goes away, they're like, "Hey, remember that bull thing? Remember that bull thing?" Okay? Bull is a timeless archetype for promiscuity. What is a bull known for but promiscuity, right? We still use this metaphor, right? We use bulls as like metaphors for like manly trucks, right? And like all of the virility things, right, in our lives. This is what a bull is for. We know that cows, female cows, if they've met a bull, can produce calves, which is what we need for our society. Cows who have met a bull can also be milked, right? But a bull means that you have creation. You have the ability to create new life. And the way a bull creates life isn't by following a bunch of rules, right? It's by giving in to the bull's own desires and gratification. You get this metaphor, okay? So this is what's happening here. This is a de-evolution away. When the cat's away, the mice will play. Away from Moses' offering to them of a good life, a good, healthy, fun, pure life. As soon as he goes away, they're like, hey, remember that bull thing we used to do? Let's do that. That's what's happening here. And there's another layer. Another layer that takes the second point of view. Remember when we talked about, when we read Scripture, there are three audiences. There's us, there's the audience it was written about, and there's the audience of the time in which it was written, the audience it was written for, which is not us. That audience is after the kingdom of Jerusalem or Judah has split into two kingdoms, a northern kingdom, and those people are bad, according to the writer, and a southern kingdom, which is where Jerusalem is, okay? In the northern kingdom, this is after they crossed the Jordan, after they've entered the land of milk and honey, after David and Solomon. They split into kingdoms because Solomon's sons fight, okay? And here's what happens. They have changed where you can worship God. This is the question here. Who has access to God, okay? You look at this, I don't know why I keep doing that. Y'all can't see that. This one here, okay? You see what Yahweh is sitting on here is the Ark of the Covenant, okay? If we had read that part of Exodus, you would have seen that it's about how it's God's judgment seat. You want to give God a cushy throne so that when you have to appeal to God, God will treat you nicely, okay? If you give God an uncomfortable throne, you're much more likely to be judged harshly because God is tired of sitting there. Okay? This is the way they imagine kings, because this is the world that kings were in. Okay? In this picture, Yahweh is sitting on the Ark of the Covenant. By the time this text is written down, the Ark of the Covenant is in the temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem. Now, the king of the north, Jeroboam, doesn't have that luxury. So he puts up two new shrines, and he gives in to the old popular ways, okay, of doing that by having Yahweh, who looks like a bull, you see that here, and has bull genitalia down here, right, sitting on a bull here, because the sitting on a bull, and sometimes you can Wikipedia this, you can Google image this if you want. The sitting on a bull, or sometimes the standing on a bull, was the human conquering all other animals, which meant that you were king of the world, top of the food chain, okay? So, Yahweh, who is very virile, is the God that we worship in the north, okay? This is a claim on who can worship God in a very obvious sort of way. We might say an unevolved, way of measuring God, but you can see why it was so obvious for them. This is from, I didn't put the book up there because it's not about the book, it's about the author. The book is from 1 Kings, okay? This is what happens. Solomon dies. Solomon's a bad king at the end of his life. He dies, and there's a quest for the throne. His sons are battling over it. Then Jeroboam, who's who was one of his sons, who moved to the north and became king. There's also a question about whether or not he was his son, but we'll say he's his son. Said to himself, now the kingdom may well revert to the house of David. If this people continues to go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem. So he's saying, now we live 100 miles north of Jerusalem. If I send my people down to Jerusalem in order to offer their sacrifices and worship God, they might get brainwashed by my brother. So I'm not going to send them down there anymore. We go to the house in Jerusalem, the heart of the people will turn. Okay, but also you need to remember that the person writing this is putting these words in Jeroboam's mouth to make Jeroboam sound like a jerk, right? The person who's writing this is in the south, writing a first-hand account from the king in the north that makes him sound stupid. You got me on that? Okay? When Shakespeare puts words in King Lear's mouth, it doesn't mean that King Lear said them. It means that Shakespeare wants you to think that King Lear said them. Okay. Then King Rehoboam of Judah, the people will turn against their master, meaning himself, and will turn again to their master, King Rehoboam of Judah, which is his brother. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam of Judah. Remember, this is what the Deuteronomistic historians want you to think that the king would say. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. He said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. You see how those are the exact same words, right? This is the same author. Now, in the way we tell the story, this was written about 300 or 400 years after that story we just read in Deuteronomy. But in real time, that line that was inserted into Deuteronomy that we were just talking about was written the same day that this was written by the same person. This is an editor. He set one in Bethel and the other one he put in Dan, and this thing became a sin. For the people went to worship before the one at Bethel and before the other one as far as Dan. So you have to understand that this is the age in which that scripture was written in Deuteronomy, so that when you look back at this picture, you understand what's really happening here. Is it about the Ark of Covenant? Is it really about the golden calf? It's about that story of Moses and Aaron, yes, but it's also about how do we worship God in a world where we don't agree anymore. Did I put you to sleep? Or do you get where we are on that? Okay. Well, I'm going to move on, but I think that's really important because we've all heard this golden calf story, but I think what you really need to know is that this is a kingdom divided in the time in which it was written, and that changes how we write the story about the golden calf. Okay, moving on. Today we're going to do 4 final stories. The Shema, Moses between a rock and a hard place, which I'd like to spend more time on, but we're simply not going to today. I don't have an easy way to do that. And then we're going to talk briefly about the book of Joshua, very briefly about the book of Joshua and then his declaration. And then we're going to finish this series with the moisture of Moses. So that'll be fun. This is called the Shema, and this is from Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Remember I told you Deuteronomy is all about tell the kids. Talk about them when you're at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. That phrase shows up in the Psalms a lot, right? Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them to your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. This is called the Shema. And before there were creeds, this is what it meant to be Jewish. It required devotion. It required an all-in attitude where God was at the forefront of your life, everywhere you went and everything that you did. And the word Shema actually means the hearing, the thing that you hear, the saying. But Scripture wasn't written, it wasn't read. In fact, no one read silently until about 1,000 years ago. Did you know that? Reading was an out loud gesture. It was the only way you would read. was out loud. There's a story about Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, right? Where the eunuch is in the chariot and he's reading out loud. And we're like, that's weird. Why would he read out loud? And you're like, oh, everyone did that all the time? Oh, okay, that story makes a lot more sense now. The Shema is the reading, it's the hearing. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, and love your... And then Jesus takes that in Matthew 22. The rich man comes to him and is like, hey, I am amazing. I've done everything right my whole life. Well, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus says. He says, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And Jesus says, and the second one is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's the Shema plus one. And I just wanted you to know that comes from Deuteronomy 6. And it's really, really beautiful, the Shema. Did Moses see God? We actually have more time than I thought we would when we got to this point, so that's a good thing. If you read Deuteronomy 33, yes, Moses finds himself in the crack in the cliff, and God walks by, and he can't see God's face to face, but he can only see his backside. Then, if you read Deuteronomy 34, which was written by the priests, the final editors, they go, nope, no one can see God. And you know how I know? Because I'm a priest. And if you can see God, I'm out of business. Right? Of course, that's what the priest would write. If you read 33 and then read 34, this is a big reason why we don't read Scripture, because it's choppy. It's not well edited. That's why I think the Message is probably the best version for a layperson to read, because otherwise the pages don't look like they've been cut and pasted all together. They look beautifully bound, but the stories are actually very much cut and pasted, and they're there intentionally to argue with one another. So 33, Moses is there, and God passes by. And there's some really great rabbinic tradition. In the Jewish tradition, they don't just have Scripture, they also have something called Midrash. And that's really missing in our Christian Bible. The Midrash was what was written in by the margins, on the margins of the page, by the rabbis. It was one of the ways to read that particular passage. And Midrash exists, and they don't always agree. They're interpretations. They're written into the sides. And in Christian tradition, somehow, after the King James Version, we just decided this scripture's too holy for anyone to add an opinion onto. Let's just leave it pure and unadulterated. And surely some Americans that we've never understood yet won't completely misread it and turn it into prosperity. Surely that won't ever happen, right? But what Midrash offered was you never felt like you were alone. If you look at Midrash, you never feel like you're reading this by yourself. There's something really beautiful about church history and Jewish history where the teachers of old are wrestling with the same thing you are. And I find it really comforting to know that Irenaeus was having the same problem that I am, or Rabbi Ben, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, was interpreting this the same way. Anyway, one of the great midrashes of does Moses see God, when it says he saw God's backside, God passed by and he saw his backside, the midrash says he does not see God, he sees where God has just been. And he says, sort of like there's a light to God, sort of like the Doppler effect with sound, right? The sound doesn't change, your experience of it changes. You know what I mean? So like with the light of God, we don't see God, we see where God has just been. And if you study the universe, the way we experience the universe is we think things are 14 billion years old because we can see light signatures that date back. If we look back. If we look back in space, we look back in time, right? And everywhere we go, we can't see God, but we can see where God has just been. And I just think that's beautiful. And then Deuteronomy 34, no one's ever seen God. That can't happen. End of sentence. And then that's the end of the book. Because the guy who writes last is the priest. Okay. Oh, that's a typo. It's not the view from Out Zebu. Somebody was running out of time here at the end. It's the view from Mount Nebu. Mount Nebu. Nebu. Yeah, can y'all tell I run out of time like right at the end of when I'm... Yeah, the east side. I appreciate that, Virgil. Thank you. The view from Mount Nebu. This is a picture of the literal view from Mount Nebu. Anybody been there? Yeah, Marianne, you've been there? And in it, you can see the Jordan River, okay? This is a really, there's actually a famous sermon written called The View from Mount Nebu, and it's a sermon about Moses, because Mount Nebu is as far as Moses gets. Moses dies at 120 years old, according to the end of Deuteronomy, on top of Mount Nebu. And it feels like he's being punished. But he's not being punished for the things he did. It feels like he's being punished for the things that the Israelites did. For all of the mistrust and all of the sins of the community, Moses gets scapegoated by God to say, you will never cross this river, the River Jordan. You will never enter the promised land. But you can get on this mountain and see the promised land. Think about this theologically for a second. If Moses, just one chapter earlier, saw where God had just been, and then in the very next chapter, he sees where God is going. Theologically, I think that's a really important way for us to see our own lives. When we look at the saints who've gone before us, and some of us, when you've lived long enough, you have saints who've been really influential in your faith journey who pass away, and you think, oh my gosh, people look up to me like I looked up to them, right? Like to them, I'm old. And I thought they were wise, and now they're gone, and I have to perpetuate their faith. Moses, in one chapter's time, sees where God has just been and where God is going. And he will not get there to the promised land. But the story doesn't end with just him. And that's just a really important lesson for all of us. We are not God's destination. We are God's vehicle so that we can point the way to where the other generations will go after us. Well, thank you, Nathan. Moses dies before crossing the Jordan. But there's also an echo here of God in the creation narrative. In the beginning, God did this and this and this. And on the seventh day, God rested. It's as if our role in life is to move forward humanity, and then we rest and let others take over. And when we see ourselves properly in God's picture, when we have our story inside of God's story, then our life becomes a gospel lesson in which we tell people who God is, not for our own sake, but because we realize that we fit in to something bigger than ourselves. And what better metaphor for that than a river? A river Jordan. You know, you never step in the same river twice. It's different water that comes in the second time. A river is not a molecule or even a couple of molecules. It is a moving, living body of water. It is not any one thing. It's not, it's all water, but it's not static. It's always moving. It's always changing. And it was used to divide up lands. This land, before we went through water, was slavery land. And then we went into wilderness land. And we're going to cross the water again, and we'll be in promised land. And at that river, Moses dies. He dies for his people. Somehow, he dies as an atonement for his people. And God, who is always doing something new that looks a lot like the old, in another 1,000 years, is going to bring his son to that same river to be baptized, to be claimed as God's own. God's own, who then later on will stand up for all of the other people, to be their leader and also to die for them. Okay, I can see I'm boring you. Let's move on. Whoa, I didn't do that. Joshua in the Battle of Jericho. So, that's what happens at the end of Deuteronomy in Numbers, and then the story of Joshua. Joshua is the apprentice to Moses, okay? If Moses is Obi-Wan, Joshua is Luke Skywalker. Joshua is a two-dimensional figure, where Moses has all these extra personality, and he's like weird and like hates his job and stuff. Joshua like stands up tall. He's always there. He's always saying the right thing and doing the right thing. And they show up to the Battle of Jericho, and the story goes that they wandered around the walls for 7 days. And if you've seen the VeggieTales version, which in my opinion is the historical version, the very French-sounding peas, right, go, you silly Israelites, don't you know these walls, they'd never fall down, right? And then Joshua, and they go around the walls for 7 days, and the seventh time around, while they're blowing their horns, and you notice that they bring the Ark of the Covenant with them. The Ark of the Covenant was where God was. It was God's seat, God's throne, and God's footstool later on when they built the whole elaborate temple. But when they brought it into battle, it was like, this is now a holy war because we brought God with us in a box. And then they made the walls fall down. That's how the story goes. The problem is, the problem's been really funny. Over the last 100 years, we thought we had some evidence that there was a city called Jericho and the walls had fallen down. And we found archaeologists who were trying to prove that the Bible was historically true in the 1950s found the rubble from the walls of Jericho that had been knocked down. The problem was, after that, we invented some new technology called carbon dating. And those walls have been knocked down 500 or 1,000 years before this story could have taken place. So that's how you know that, sometimes we just embellish the story the way we want to. There was a city that was knocked down. Oh, yeah, I did that. We did that. That was us. We did that. Our God did that. You got to love how those stories, of course, in the time and place in which that story would have been told, nobody knew that they didn't have carbon dating, right? They're like, oh, those walls, there's a bunch of walls knocked down. Yeah, my ancestors did that, right? My great-grandpa, he told me once, he had some wine, and then he told me that he and his buddies, they marched around those walls, and they made those walls fall down. It's true. You call my granddad a liar, right? That this is how myths get started. You got to love that. And, the archaeologists of the 20th century and the 19th century were really they started with the basis that the Bible was historically accurate. And then they tried to find these civilizations. And that was really interesting that they didn't find what they thought they were going to find, but then they found a lot of other cool stuff. So that works out. And then we get to the end. we get to the end of Joshua. I really thought this was all going to take, man, I've been like moving at this fast pace and we got 10 minutes left. That's fine. We get to the end of Joshua, and you've heard me talk about this before because I just think this is great. In a world full of chaos, they left slavery. They went to freedom. God gave them some rules. Then their leader died, Moses. They crossed another river, and all of a sudden they're in a foreign land. How many of you have ever stepped off a plane or a boat into a foreign country and everything's different? And you feel like you're different. Like you don't even know who you are anymore because everything's different. The language, the air smells different, the culture, the crops are different, the potatoes are purple and the asparagus is white, and like there's like no truth. There's like no truth left in the world. Yeah, that happened to me in Germany, and you're like, what is happening? Everything feels different. And Joshua gets there at the end, and he's like, look, you can be whatever you want. But today, you need to decide whom you serve. And he says, I don't know about you, but as for me and my house, we will follow the Lord. And I think that's just really poetic, and I think it's just really important for all of our lives. The truth is, every day we live in a new world. No one's lived in tomorrow yet. It hasn't happened. And we are going to find ourselves wondering who we are. And it is not the past that defines us. It is God. The God of the past and the present and the future. And you've heard me say this before, but I just love, as for me and my house, we will follow the Lord. I said in a couple of weeks ago in a sermon that it's the Wi-Fi code at my house. At my house, the Wi-Fi network is called the Pugh house, and the Wi-Fi code is Joshua 24:15, right? And I said that in a sermon, and then somebody handcrafted for me a beautiful piece of artwork that says, it's hanging in my office right now. As for me and my house, we will follow the Lord. Sisters and brothers, we live amidst chaos. We don't get to choose what tomorrow brings. We could die tomorrow. We could have something great happen to us tomorrow. But probably we're going to be faced with a bunch of little opportunities to choose God. We're going to be faced with a multitude of questions and answers, conversations and relationships, time for eye contact or to look away, time for us to spend our money wisely or not, time for us to value each other or not, time for us to meddle in other people's affairs or not. We choose God or not 1,000,000 times every day, and I think Joshua still has something to say to us about that. Now, I can't let you go until I tell you this one story about the moisture of Moses. On Mount Nebo, when Moses is dying, there are these odd words said about him. They say, he hasn't lost his strength. He hasn't gotten any wrinkles. And he still has all of his moisture. Now, that's a weird phrase to say. But of course, they're talking about his virility. They're saying that Moses, at 120 years old, can still procreate children. Okay? Now, you were not expecting that. Except you've been in my Bible study long enough. You know, eventually the truth's going to come out. I am not making this up. Scholars have written about this for centuries. The moisture of Moses. It's what it's called. That's what the line says, is this, the moisture of Moses. That at the end of his days, he's still virile, and it still works. He could still create children. And that's really important, actually, because it means that we have hope for humanity. And these are Rob Bell's words. I'll give you those, and then I'll conclude. This is Rob Bell's book, How to Read the Bible. Rob Bell's arguably my favorite author of all time, And this book is one of his books that's on my recommended reading list on Pinterest. Christmas is coming up. You can check it out. When the writer tells us that Moses wasn't wrinkled and his strength hadn't abated and he still had his force, the writer's telling us that Moses was still able to participate in the creation of this new kind of tribe that would take the world a new direction away from all the violence and destruction. Can the world head in a new direction, or are we trapped, doomed to repeat the same old tired cycle of conflict? That's the question at the heart of this Abraham and Moses story. Of course, the question is just as relevant today as it was in Moses' day. And of course, the question meant everything when Moses was called by God to lead the Hebrew people out of slavery into Egypt. After all, why would Moses even try, or why would anyone follow him if they believed that once a slave, always a slave? The very beginning of Exodus is the story of what happened to the descendants of Joseph. Joseph is a descendant of Jacob. Jacob is a descendant of Isaac. Isaac is a descendant of Abraham. And Abraham still had moisture at 100 years old. The story started with an impossible pregnancy of Elizabeth. When we thought nothing new could happen, when we thought old dogs couldn't learn new tricks, when women of a certain age were not considered to be interesting anymore, God did something new, even when we were old and rotten, even when we thought we had nothing left, even when we thought everything that could be done had been done. God did something new. That sets in motion the story of Abraham, which sets in motion the story of Moses. Those people in Egypt found a better life because they believed in a hopeful tomorrow. Now, it's a silly thing to talk about the virility of Moses on his deathbed. But the point there is that he, even on his last day, was willing to be part of a new creation, a new tribe to do something new. And sisters and brothers, I just have to tell you, the world we live in cannot stay this way. There are way too many problems going on right now that we cannot turn our eyes from. We need to see all human beings as people of dignity, no matter where on our borders they are. We need to know that having nuclear weapons enough to blow up the planet that we need to live on is not okay. We need to know that the threats facing our world are mostly made by us. We need to know that we cannot continue to exploit all of the land and leave those people who live in the land that we're exploiting without anything. We can't keep doing that. We need to know that climate change is real and that we have a part to play in that. None of these problems will be solved unless we imagine a new hope in which we still have agency in it. That's what the moisture of Moses is about. Your ability to create something new, even at the end of your days. So, sisters and brothers, I know that's not what you expected. But the story of Moses reminds us that the view from Mount Nebo is God's view. God watches us march into a new land every day. And God hopes that we find it to be a promised land. A promised land where we learn to live as the freed non-slaves that we have been created and liberated to be. So I hope that you take Moses with you and that everywhere you go, there is still life and virility and vitality in everything that you do. So have a great night. Thanks for coming out to the Exodus Bible Study, and we'll see you back next week for William Paul Young. Thanks, guys.